This is the Alpha Human Podcast, and I'm your host, Lawrence Rosenberg. Today's guest is U.S. Army Green Beret Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann. With a distinguished 23-year military career, he served in combat operations spanning from Colombia through to Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, retired from Special Forces, Scott trains corporate leaders, law enforcement, and military teams on the critical importance of motivating people to action in low trust, high stakes environments through his company, Rooftop Leadership. Scott is also the founder of the Hero's Journey, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping warriors and first responders find their voice and share their stories, supporting them as they transition from military service to civilian life. In addition to this, Scott is an accomplished playwright and actor who created the powerful stage play Last Out, Elegy of a Green Beret, which sheds light on the untold stories of veterans and the profound cost of war on military families. And as if that wasn't impressive enough, Scott is also the #1 best-selling author of Game Changers, Going Local to Defeat Violent Extremists, as well as the hit book, Operation Pineapple Express, about the grassroots mission that helped rescue our Afghan elite forces allies and their families during the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, his latest book, which is coming out soon, it's called Nobody is Coming to Save You, a Green Beret's Guide to Getting Big SHIT Done. And this book reveals how to make an impact and change your world when the odds are stacked against you, when your people are distrustful and divided, and when you feel disconnected and disengaged. This book delivers the methods that Green Berets use to get vital stuff done when stakes are high and conditions are seemingly impossible. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lawrence. Wow, that was super humbling. I don't know what to say.
There's actually a lot more I could have said. That's me editing it down. I mean, you've accomplished just an enormous amount of positive and productive work in your life, and obviously it just seems like you're just getting started. So thank you. First of all, thank you for doing the podcast, and thank you for your service.
No, I appreciate it, man. It's funny too. When I was listening to that, I feel every time I hear it, I feel like such an imposter. I constantly feel like I'm out over my skis way more than I should be. And I don't know that will ever go away.
Well, the title of the book is Getting Big SHIT Done. And, I think everyone has a bit of that, what do they call it? Imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I think those, it's ironic really, but those who think they've got it all figured out, those who are, have that conceit and arrogance such that they think that they walk on water, they often fail, while maybe those of us who are always questioning whether we're capable or not, but actually take action, somehow figure it out.
Yeah, I think that's true. My dad, who's my hero, has always said his motto is "Don't strut." And he was a big firefighter, and his team even adopted that motto. And I do think it's really important, and it's hard sometimes when you see it happening all around you. But I think it's important if you're gonna try to play at a high level, to not take yourself too seriously and recognize that you're going to fail more than you succeed, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've certainly learned that over the course of my life. But I've had the privilege to read an advanced copy of your latest book, Nobody's Coming to Save You. All right, a Green Beret's Guide to Getting Big SHIT Done. And I'm really excited to talk with you about the ideas and the concepts and the solutions that you present. But first of all, I got to say, it is a phenomenal read. It's a very interesting book, Scott. And also, what a title. Great, great title.
Thanks, man. The title is actually something that has been bouncing around in my head for years, since I was a Green Beret. It was something that in various forms, Green Beret sergeants, senior NCOs would say to me a lot. was, nobody's coming. My dad's motto on big wildland fires was, "You have all there is," and I just, after I came home from the war, Lawrence, and I looked around the country, and it seems like a lot of times we're in this state of paralysis where we have this notion that some institutional leader is going to come down and make our life better, or put some change, some politician is going to create some policy that all of a sudden our life's, improved, dramatically day to day. And I just don't buy it. I don't, everything that I've done in my life has been bottom up. It's been local. It's had strategic effects at times, but it's always been local in its implementation. And it was always when you feel like there should be somebody else doing it. There should be somebody else doing this who's far more qualified than me, but they're not coming, and finally it just, after Operation Pineapple Express, people kept asking me. I'd been working on a leadership book for years. They kept asking me, how do you write a play when you're not a playwright? How do you help rescue Afghans when you're not in the country and you're retired? And I didn't have necessarily a good answer, except that nobody was coming. and here's what I did. And it turned out that it's not a bad body of work for anybody these days who's got aspirations to play a bigger game, but feels jammed up.
Yeah. No, I mean, so it really comes through. I mean, it really speaks to that. But maybe, you know what, before we dive into the book, because I have a number of questions about the book's content and the concepts you write about, I want to set the stage for our audience. It's really, I think, your unique experience as a Green Beret that has equipped you to assess the pressing issues you highlight in the book. Issues like what you just mentioned, but, trust, human connection, overcoming obstacles in today's very disorienting world and culture. I think through your service, you not only developed the ability to recognize and understand these challenges, but also forged these practical strategies to address them and get that big stuff done. So with that said, I think most people have heard of the Green Berets, right? Yeah. Especially my audience, but they might not fully grasp what sets them apart. There's a significant difference between the Green Berets and other elite units like Navy SEALs, Delta Force. When people think of special operations, they often picture door kickers and assault teams taking out the high-value targets. And while that's certainly part of the job, it's just a small fraction of what Green Berets do. So it's often said, I think those of us who romanticize the Green Berets, it's often put forth such that you hear about how a handful of Green Berets could overthrow a government, upend leadership, foment a revolution. So I think beyond direct action operations, could you explain what makes the Green Berets unique and describe the full scope of what they do? Because I think it speaks volumes about how you develop the capabilities you wield today, which have allowed you to accomplish what you have both during and after your Special Forces career.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're right that there are, first of all, a lot of all the special operations units that are out there by design have very specific missions, and as you said, most of them are some version of surgical strike, and Green Berets can do some of that. But if you look at what Green Berets have done throughout history, Lawrence, we really draw our lineage back to World War II. During the Nazi occupation of Europe and even in Indochina, small teams, they were called Jedburgh teams from the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, dropped into Nazi-occupied Europe behind enemy lines in teams of 3. And they stayed behind enemy lines for the entire war. And they would work by, with, and through European partisans. And they would help them stand up, organize, equip, train, recruit, and then advise them in combat. And they would do subversion and sabotage behind the lines and really disrupt at a very high level. And this type of warfare is called unconventional warfare. Some people call it guerrilla warfare, but I think unconventional warfare is probably more accurate. And at the heart of it is working by, with, and through indigenous people to help them stand up on their own. And I tell people, if you want to apply it to modern day avatars, a Green Beret is a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. In other words, they are relationship-based connectors who happen to be lethal, but only when it's necessary. And it's a level of surgical lethality. It's a baseline. You know, John Wick in the movies, he's a reluctant fighter
Mm-hmm.
in the sense, and he's very surgical. Although he's super lethal, he's very surgical. And I think that's appropriate for when you think about how Green Berets apply their lethality. They have to apply it very surgically within a population that they need to win over.
Mm-hmm.
And then T.E. Lawrence was a British intelligence officer who was a former geologist in 1917 that basically inspired the Badou Nation, a tribe nomads, to cross the Sahara and take the city of Aqaba from the desert, which had never been done. And he used old school interpersonal skills to do that. I call them Lawrenceian skills, which is really the heart of what a Green Beret does, rapport building. And then finally, the Verizon guy, you know, the little guy that pops up under a manhole cover. Can you hear me now? And then he's in the desert. Can you hear me now? But the idea is that he represents just this obsession with connection. And that's the other thing that Green Berets are very good at. You might have, you know, 12 Green Berets in Afghanistan right after 9/11, and it looks like a small team, but at night, the team leader goes off to a piece of high ground and he cacks out an HF Morse code message that goes to the president, you know? And so they have this very, very obsessive relationship with networks and connections. So they go local, but they have strategic effects. And if you stop and think about it, that's really what we need today in these times that we live in. We need leaders who can take care of business. I'm not talking about lethality, but they're coercive to the degree that they need to be as a baseline reality to stand up for what needs to be stood up for. But the preponderance of their skills are Lawrencian, by, with, and through, influence authentically. And then finally, you know, the Verizon guy, they know how to build networks. They know how to connect and bridge and build massive networks to get things done. So hopefully that gives a sense of what we do and why I'm so adamant about bringing these skills to leaders today, because I think it's an unprecedented set of challenges that they face that require these skills.
Yeah, you know, I have to tell you, after reading your book, I got inspired to watch the film, Lawrence of Arabia. Surprisingly, I've never seen it. And it's a classic. And so my wife and I, we've been watching it. It's phenomenal. And if you and it makes so much sense when you use T.E. Lawrence as one of the avatars for a Green Beret. I think that anyone who wants to understand the big superpowers of a Green Beret needs to watch that film and see the scale, the sheer scale, and the impossible nature of what was thought could never be done, and what this one man, again, just through those connection and relationship building skills, is able to pull off is mind-boggling. I mean, it's a great film nonetheless. I mean,
yeah,
but
well said. And you know, the thing is, he was highly decorated for valor. But no one remembers that. What they remember is what he did through his storytelling and his influence skills. And I will tell you, Lawrence, the Green Berets that I worked with throughout my time, and that were iconic, and I'm not one of them, but I got to be around some of them. They were great storytellers. They were also, but they were vicious fighters when they needed to be. They could take care of business like nobody's business. But that wasn't what they were known for. It wasn't, to this day, what they're remembered for. It was their ability to bridge across a gap and build rapport in times when nobody else could do it, and to be able to paint a picture with indigenous partners of what could be in the time of total chaos, just like we did with those tribesmen, to show them that they could liberate the crown jewel of Aqaba in a way that was seemingly impossible. He told great stories. Green Berets that get things done, and I think leaders that get big things done, are great storytellers.
Without question, without question. So I'm going to quote you from the book.
Okay.
We'll get into it now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to quote you from the book, and I'll ask you a question. Our most urgent mission was not to use the village as a staging ground for raids against the Taliban. but to connect with the village and bring them around to our side. The people here were isolated and tribal. They were naturally sympathetic to the Taliban, even if the Taliban didn't have their interests at heart. To save American lives, reduce the Taliban's reach into Afghanistan cities, and secure this little village and their way of life, that needed to change. However, the Special Forces community had been living in walled compounds for years, always keeping the local populace at bay. Now we faced a need to connect more effectively with people who were disconnected from each other and from us. It wouldn't be easy to suddenly ask for a sit down with village leaders and say, we're from the government. How do you like us so far? Mind if we live here? So the mission of the Green Berets is de oppressor liber, right? To free the oppressed. But many times, as in Afghanistan, as you write, the oppressed are suspicious of our motives, and they're unsure whether you're truly there to help them or to harm them. So I'll ask, how do Green Berets go about freeing the oppressed, especially when their initial perception is that you may be a foe, not a friend?
It all comes down to rapport. It really does, because by definition, Green Berets are going to be dropped into low trust, high risk areas. That's where they're going to go by definition. So that's what you're walking into. You're going to walk into a situation where a group of elders are glaring at you with narrow eyes and tickling the triggers of their AK-47s, trying to decide whether or not they're going to dispatch you right there. Right, that's what you're walking into. And I will tell you, Lawrence, even in our qualification course, we build scenarios at the end where candidates are put through those tests to see if they can, around a fire pit, if they can build rapport, or if they lose rapport and get tossed out of the G base, or worse, they looked at as criminals or whatever by the host nation. So we start training on it very early. But a lot of people, here's what I'll say. A lot of people think that it's just instinct. You either have rapport skills or you don't. So in that moment of truth, there's, you either have the ability to establish rapport or you don't have it. And I disagree with that. I think that in those moments of low trust, when people are emotional and they are afraid or they're angry, there's actually a ton of science and skill that can allow leaders to reduce the emotional temperature and get the other party ready to listen to what you have to say. And that is what Green Berets have to do in those initial moments. They have to assess the emotional temperature in the room. They have to use really, really solid, old school interpersonal skills to see the pictures in the head of the other party. And then they have to employ those interpersonal skills, mostly questionology, open-ended questions that allow the other party to answer a narrative and then bring the emotional temperature down from a sympathetic state of fight, flight, or freeze to a parasympathetic state of calm and connect, where the other party is ready to listen to what you have to say, because they see that you see the pictures in their heads. They see that you are relevant to their goals and relatable to their pain. And if you stop and think about it, that is exactly what you need to do when your daughter has been bullied on Instagram.
How so?
Well, because she is in a highly aroused emotional state of fight, flight, or freeze. The human operating system that's at the core of my book, and that we still teach to Green Berets in various forms today, has not changed in 250,000 years, right? The amygdala doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger in the bushes and your 401k eroding over 6 months. It doesn't. It just sees a threat that could harm you. And so our primal brain goes to that fight, flight, or freeze mentality, and we go into a trance state where all the energy moves to certain parts of our body and we're just fighting to survive. So the ears stop working. That's why if you ever get in a fight with your spouse, not that you ever would, I'm sure, but or anybody listening ever would, but have you noticed that when it goes elevated, you don't hear each other anymore? You literally neither person, the ears stop working. Soldiers will tell you in a gunfight that the bullets get quiet because the ears don't need to work anymore. So when we get to that emotionally charged state, we're not even in the physiology to listen. And so we have to manage that energy as leaders, and that's what Green Berets do.
So when you walk into that village, hostile village, right? And you're looking to convince the elders of that village to join you in overthrowing their oppressors, and kind of join you on the rooftop, so to speak.
Yeah.
Fight with you on the rooftop.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're walking into that. That's the high level. Um, that's that where they're at is in that amygdala state, right? That's where they're right. That's where they're at when you get there. And you talk about the rapport building skills, but what is, but then there's the leadership aspect to this, right? So I want to ask, what is rooftop leadership, right? Because there's a great story in the book that encapsulates,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
how you get them to join you on the rooftop. I guess that's the origin story of
Yeah.
how you came up with the name Rooftop Leadership. So
Yeah.
so how do you get in there when everyone feels like your daughter might, after she's been bullied on social media, and you're coming in, and you've got to create that rapport. But let's say you create the rapport. Great. Now you got rapport. How are you going to get these people,
Right.
who aren't your people, to risk their lives for your mission?
Great questions, man. And I think it's smart to start at kind of the high level, and rooftop leadership. Rooftop is a metaphor for inspiring or influencing people authentically to do very challenging things when they're reluctant or afraid or angry, or just whatever emotion it is that's precluding them from doing it. You got to get something big done, like you got to stabilize a village that is strategic, but the churn of division and disconnection in that village is so high that they don't even want you there. So how are you going to defend a village or make a village a collective antibody to the Taliban when those people are so terrified of the Taliban and so angry at you, they're not even going to try? And so that's why it starts with the rapport piece. You've got to gain entry. You've got to get the other party ready to listen. That's what rapport does. Rapport gets the other party ready to listen to what you have to say. Then you have to say some things, but more importantly, you have to demonstrate some things that will ultimately, hopefully, result in people going up onto that rooftop. In this case, literally going up onto rooftops and fighting when the attack comes. But I will tell you, it's two things. One, I think it's modeling your commitment to whatever it is you're asking them to do, even if they don't do it. So in the beginning of the teams going into these villages, oftentimes they would go up to the rooftops at night when they would get attacked, and the villagers would stay down below with their families. And they, our guys would take casualties, but they would still surgically defend that village. They would withhold fire if they weren't sure they had a clean shot. Where the Taliban were setting up machine gun nests at the base of the homes of these farmers, and so that started to carry its own weight right there. But seeing our guys, carried off buildings or carried out on a medevac helicopter defending their village, is in modeling what that looks like to stand up when others won't, even when you're afraid and when you don't feel like anybody's coming to support you. You're still up there. That's number one. And then number two is building trust when risk is low, right? Is building the relationship in what I've found in life. The relationship is the asset. There's all kinds of capital in this world, but there's no capital greater than social capital. The tangible and intangible linkages between humans that allow us to collectively do big things. And so, Green Berets understand that it's the moments in between where you build trust. It's when you go out and you help a farmer figure out how to dry sun-dried tomatoes, or his 7-year-old girl who's never seen a doctor desperately needs an immunization and your medic does it. Or you go up, so it's building trust when risk is low, because you understand that the relationship is the asset. And at some point that relationship is going to pay out. And so you take the time to build that trust when risk is low. And then ultimately, at some point, you look across the rooftop and you see a muzzle flash and you hear some shots being fired. And it's a farmer that is standing up finally, because he's made a decision to do so of his own volition. He wasn't forced to do it. He chose to do it. And then that is all, fear is contagious, but that's contagious too. When that starts to happen at a grassroots level, one person goes to the rooftop, then three, then five, then ultimately the whole community is firing back, doing what they've always done. They've reclaimed their agency. And it's at this point that you can kind of get out of the way and let that community do what it was born to do, that collective. And I saw this over and over again, Lawrence, in 113 villages across Afghanistan, and in some of the roughest places I've ever seen, where this same formula was applied in various forms. And I believe that the rooftop is a metaphor, honestly, for the unprecedented churn that we now face here at home.
Okay, that's okay, phenomenal. That really paints, that really, you know, again, this is what I love about the book, because you get into the psychology of human nature, but you also are able to give practical strategies for how to accomplish these things that you're speaking of. So that's phenomenal. Thank you. You mentioned the churn. So now I want to get, it's perfect time. I want to get into that.
Yeah.
So you say so quoting you here, the churn, it divides and isolates people. It erodes confidence in ourselves and our friends, family, and institutions. It fuels fear and anger and self-righteousness. So this what you call, right, the enemy, the churn, you saw it in generations of war-ravaged Afghanistan and its people, but you see it far more, you personally see it, you talk about it in the book, you see it in a far more profound way, right here, right now in America. So can you talk to us about the churn, what this monster that haunts our culture is?
I came up with that because, the brain works in metaphor, rooftop, churn. That's how the brain makes sense of things. And so I came up with that metaphor when I was on active duty, and I would try to explain to very high level officials this program that was happening on these rooftops across Afghanistan. And I would try to describe that for 10 years, the first 10 years of the war, we thought that these elders and these tribes were the enemy, and at least we acted like it. And they weren't. That elder that's, it's looking at you with contempt, and that even has some level of tolerance for the Taliban. He's not your enemy, right? It is a set of Taliban is your enemy, but there is also a set of social conditions, 40 years of war that this elder has gone through, that has contributed to the state that he's in, this trance-like state of fear and anger that he's in, and it's contagious, right? And when I came home from the war and I retired in 2013, one of the first things that happened to me, I thought I had the tiger by the tail. I'd had a great life as a high-performing Green Beret. I was retiring on my terms, write a book, finally go fishing. And it turns out that within a very short period of time, I started to struggle at home. It was as if I had changed planets, and it was a country that I didn't recognize anymore. I looked around in 2013, Lawrence, at the levels of division that were happening in the country. It seemed like the country was on fire, whether it was around race or religion or politics. And Sebastian Junger wrote a book called Tribe that I found during that period of time. It was right around there, maybe a little later, but it said combat veterans are more than willing to die for their country. They just don't know how to live for it, because it's hard to know how to live for a country that's tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from race to religion to politics. And that's exactly how I felt. I thought, man, all that we did over there, all the friends that we lost, all the blood that was shed, just so we can tear ourselves apart right here at home, and that really it really opened up the opportunity for all the demons that I had suppressed to come in a very big way. And so the realization that the churn was in the United States, in the West, in an unprecedented novel way, almost took me out. I almost took my own life. It led to a series of mental health challenges. But the point that I'm making here is that as I did come out of that mental health fog, and I saw that, okay, well, I've been here before. I know what this is. This is something that is unprecedented and novel here in the West, but I've seen it. I know how this ends, and there actually is a way to lead through this. But what got you here is not going to get you there. Instinct's not going to be good enough. The stuff you learned in corporate leadership is not going to get it done. This transactional mindset of short form communications and it's PowerPoint, like that actually contributes to this churn that has now made it to the United States. And I call it the 4Ds: distraction, disengagement, disconnection, and distrust. And all of those create this novel set of conditions that puts us pretty much in a fear-based trance, that primal trance all the time. And at the same time, you have these divisionist leaders, politicians, corporate leaders, media, who are supposed to be the stewards of a civil society that has, neighbor engagement, institutions we can trust, and stories we believe in. They've abandoned all that in order to foment instability for a narrow agenda, in groups and out groups. And so I'm looking at all that going, wow, that's a perfect storm, man. Like that is a really rough environment to try to raise your family, to try to, grow your business, or to try to, reach across the aisle to a client that has a different political affiliation than you, or just to have a conversation at the holidays over, Trump and Biden, whatever. It's a very, very unique, novel set of circumstances that we don't even really have a language for in the civilian world. So what if I could bring that body of work into the churn and help people understand the human operating system, how it works, and then the interpersonal skill set that can help them do whatever it is they're doing in this new reality. And that's what I've been doing really for like the last 13 years.
Wow. So you talk about that human operating system and how understanding the system allows us to see the problem as one would see an iceberg sticking out of the water, right?
Yeah.
And that we spend 100% of our time focused on just 25% of what makes us who we are.
Yeah.
We live, as you say, we live in a left brain dominated world, even though our foundation and development is, all there below the waterline and
Right.
and steeped in what you call right brain attributes. So can you kind of just, talk about this a little bit? Left brain,
Yeah.
right brain,
Yeah.
what's this all about?
So it's, when you read the book, there's a lot of stories, and the idea is stories are what move us. So, as you come through and as you've navigated it expertly here, Lawrence, you'll get to a point in the book where about 1/3 of the way through, I would ask you to take a breath, get your favorite beverage, and it's where we start to talk about the churn and, more importantly, the human operating system. And we're gonna slow it down, and we got to break it down. We got to break down, like, if you're going to deal with the churn, whether you're building a nonprofit or you're growing your business or you just want to be more impactful as a parent or in your community, and you don't want to get sucked up in that churn that's all around us. We've got to get back to our nature. This is what we, when I taught Green Berets and when I teach federal law enforcement, I tell them the same thing. When you go into a low trust environment, which is unfortunately a lot of places today, you have to know how the human operating system works. You have to have a deeper appreciation for your nature. And the reality is, if I could give the bumper sticker here on this podcast, we have not changed. Humans, depending on your beliefs, have been around for a couple 100,000 years. We have really not changed in that 250,000 years. We haven't. And so if you apply that to an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is the modern world where we all live, work, and play. And it's all the problems that we have, from cash flow to, the recession to the election madness. But that's only about 20% of our humanity. It's only a couple 100 years old. iPhones and droids are only 20 years old, but they've radically changed how we operate. And as you said, we spend 100% of our time in that tip of the iceberg world, but below the waterline, on the metaphor of this iceberg, which is human operating system or human nature, that's the traditional world. That's where we all come from. That's where we hail from. It's the hunters, the gatherers. It's the bulk of Afghanistan and other areas that have not socially evolved into a level of modernity. We all come from. And we are very much still in it. It's just invisible to us. In other words, our ancient ways, our traditional ways, the way that we respond when someone offends us or we feel slighted, is a primal response that lives below the waterline of that iceberg. But because we always have our heads down in these things in a trance-like state, we're not even connected or conscious of those human responses that we have in these modern times. And I'll give you just a quick example of the chunk.
Please.
But one of the things that Jonathan Haidt talks about in Why the Last 10 Years in America Have Been Uniquely Stupid, his article in The Atlantic, is he says that, you know, in these things, when they were designed, what they found, the engineers, was that you're much more, it's an attention-based economy, so they want to hold your attention. You're much more likely to share information if it is information about an outgroup that is fear or anger-based, right? So they learned that if they can collate us into different groups, then we will more likely share information readily about outgroups. And so what they're actually doing is fomenting, engineers are engineering, divisionists are engineering in-group, out-group behavior that is feudal and tribal and 250,000 years old in a represented reality. So we leave the natural world and we come into this tribal feud that's represented for us and actually puts us in that trance state all the time. That's why people are in the red all the time, you know, versus you're only supposed to be super angry or super afraid for a very short period of time. It's to survive. You're not supposed to stay there, but people are staying there. And if we don't understand those elements of our operating system that are primal and that you know, work a certain way and appreciate them, then we're just walking around in a trance like everybody else. So that chunk of the book is to help people understand that, for example, the divided brain. We have, all mammals have divided brains. Left hemisphere is mostly focused on language and controlling and acquiring, whereas the right hemisphere is more focused on the relationship to the natural world, human connections, creativity, storytelling, and both fire at the same time. It's not an either or. It's both are necessary. But there's a lot of evidence to show in the last however many years that we have, the right hemisphere has gone dormant and the left hemisphere has really taken over in its obsession with control and manipulation and, you know, manipulating an environment inside these things. And so we're losing our agency, we're losing our autonomy as humans, and we're losing our connection to our own nature. So that part of the book, and I really need people to dig into that, because it's not, I don't feel like it's super lecture based, but
No.
there is science in there, important neuroscience and other types of science and studies that will help you reframe and define your human operating system, your kids' human operating systems, and the people that you try to serve, so that you have a better appreciation of this primal creature. And that, as Adam Ghazali says, we're ancient brains just trying to make sense of a high-tech world. So let's give all that its due. Let's understand what we're really working with here below the waterline, because that's where we live. And it's where most of the threats and opportunities that we deal with actually reside.
So, okay, so we're still tribal, but the churn and contract transactional societies have us obsessing on the what appears to be the worst elements of our primal roots.
Yeah, I call it shadow tribalism. We're behaving in a tribal way, but we don't even know we're doing it. We think we're all modern and sophisticated, but we're really just well-dressed Neanderthals.
But then yes, right, that you get into that. Yeah. But then you make a big point about how there's a lot of reward. There's a lot of good things about our ancient tribal societies, right? And so we're obsessing on the worst elements of it, but instead of the most rewarding parts of tribal societies, and that social bond, right? I mean, that's
that's right. And I've talked about this a good bit, and I think it's important to understand that a lot of times when we say, "Oh, they're going tribal," you know, it can have this derogatory form to it, and I don't think that's accurate. I think that that's why I said shadow tribalism, because it's basically taken the darker sides of a informal civil society, and it's feud and anger and shame, and we've kind of like gravitated to those. But there's other elements that we all hail from that are around community, that our ancient roots promote us to be social, to be storytellers, to be better listeners, to value relationships, very, very much, and to value family, and these are elements of our ancient past. This is
Right.
there was a guy named Alexander de Tocqueville when he came to the United States, and he looked at this experiment that we call democracy. He went back and said, what they have that no one else has is individualism rightly understood. They have this sense of the individual. They value the individual. They put the individual above the in-group and the out-group, which is amazing, but it's still rightly understood. There's a foot above the waterline of the iceberg in the modern world, but there's also a foot below. And this is where I would say, for anybody reading the book, that's what this gives you. Everybody that you're going to deal with in the time of churn, most likely, has both feet above the waterline, living in the modern world, and they are oblivious to all of the tribal things that are pressing on them and driving them to action subconsciously. And you see it in the way people drive in traffic and road rage. But if you have a foot above the waterline and a foot below the waterline, where you have this appreciation and understanding that humans are meaning-seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle. In other words, we're a mess, but there's certain attributes below that waterline that if you tap into meaning or storytelling, that you can influence what those problems are above the waterline in a way that nobody else can, which makes you more relevant to people's goals, and it makes you more relatable to their pain. And what I found in combat, what I found in conflict, what I found in low trust, Lawrence, is that's actually what people follow. We follow leaders who are relevant to our goals and relatable to our pain. And the ultimate goal of my book is to help readers do that.
No question about that. So let's delve a bit deeper into that. How does someone remain grounded, rooted in tribal, primal, social contract society, while still being able to operate in the virtually connected, digital driven world where we're sequestered away and are, quote, I'm going to quote you here, indoors, secluded, staring at screens, the left brain churning, no right brain awareness of the world around us. You say this is a massive challenge for any rooftop leader, how to remain connected with their humanity as they run the digital seams serving the greater good, because that was you, and Pineapple Express, Operation Pineapple Express, locked away in that dark room, just on, in the Signal chat room constantly.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. There's a lot of people out there that work remote, that are locked away indoors, that are on their laptops, they're on their phones. They're hardly even getting outside. They never even leave the house because they're working at home and they're living at home, and they're always so what you experienced for that condensed time during Operation Pineapple Express, people are experiencing that like 24/7, month after month, year after year. So like how do you, as you said there, how do you remain connected with your humanity while running the digital seams?
Such a good question. And it's a body of work. It takes a lot of practice. And even when you develop a system for it, I'll catch myself back in my phone when I shouldn't be, or not present with my wife when I should be. And so you just have to make a correction and get back on the trail. You'll come off. But I think it starts with, Lawrence, this awareness and this appreciation that there is an iceberg, first of all. Okay. That there is an iceberg, and we need to get back. If we're going to get back to our nature, right? That's the first. That is the way that we build better relationships. We become more relevant and relatable. We get back to our nature, to our human operating system, which means we have to get below the waterline. We have to start to get some appreciation and integration of those invisible truths that make us human, about meaning and emotion and social connection and storytelling and struggle. And each of those is a chapter in the book. And I know you're going to tee that up, but I needed to just say that there, because once you start to, get in, and it's a lifetime work. You get below the waterline and you start going, okay, let's look at meaning for a second. When is the last time I actually evaluated my purpose in life, or what it is that I'm here to do? Or as I say in the book, what tracks are you leaving? What's your legacy? What is it that you're here to do? What will people say about you 15 years after you're gone, to someone who held your hand in your final moments? That is we are meaning-seeking creatures. We navigate the world and we assign meaning to everything that we do. So if we're running hard and not thinking about it, we've lost connection to our purpose. And because we're meaning seeking, meaning assigning creatures, that causes us to just lose our way. So one of the things I think we have to do is go back and reclaim our agency, reclaim our purpose. And we have to do this often. We have to help the people we love do that. We have to make sure that our business coming out of COVID has reevaluated its organizational purpose. It's probably been scuffed up. Has it changed? Has it altered? Meaning is an essential item. It's why disengagement and quiet quitting is so high, because there's an absence of purpose in our civil society. So that's one example. Another one is because we are going around with these dopamine dispensers and living in this represented world all the time, we are not in the natural world. And that's where stuff happens. That's where relationships are built. Relationships are not built in here. Relationships are built in the natural world. Things mostly happen in the natural world, no matter how much we want them to be in here. And I think we have to reconnect to the natural world more. We have to do more digital detoxes. We have to build systems for like putting this thing down on a Friday and not touching it once a month. We have to like not get on it before 10. We have to put it down 2 hours before we go to bed. We have to start. There's such an entanglement, and AI is not even here yet. If we don't start doing this now, we're going to be so entangled in this represented reality that we're not going to be able to connect to the natural world. Now, what would happen if a bird did that? If a bird just dismissed its relationship with the natural world and just hopped around eating bird seed because it tastes good, what would happen to the bird?
Yeah, that's it. It's over.
That's it. Species extinction, and so I don't think we're any different. And so it's bigger than just our mental health. It's bigger than just effectiveness within our family. I think our survival depends on it. And no one's going to tell you to do it. Nobody's coming. We've got to figure out a way to do it. So I hope that answered the question. There's a lot of tactics that I put in the book about that, because honestly, I don't think I probably even came close to where we need to do to solve it or deal with it. But hopefully, it gets the conversation going and gets people thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot in the book. There's a lot, and it's all very compelling. And I start to think about, and maybe it's inferred, or maybe it's obvious. It just seems like, it's impractical. It's probably not. It's not possible for a lot of people. But it just sounds like we'd all be better off if we went back to, that social tribal society that we once were. But
Yeah.
Time marches on, right?
I had that conversation with a guy the other day, and I don't disagree. I mean, honestly, there's because I do, Monty and I do detoxes pretty often now, and wonderful when we do them. It's you Jones at first, and then
right,
and then you don't have them. The other thing, I just want to say this, and this, I don't know if this is in the book or not. I can't remember, but we are in the election season right now, and I just want to say something about, regardless of your politics, and I try to be really apolitical as I talk about this stuff. Elections today are a prime example of the churn. They are a prime example of how what you see in elections today, you didn't see 20 years ago. This is a new, novel set of circumstances where if you say to someone in your family, I'm voting for this person, there's a very good chance they could unfriend you. And you think about that, we have normalized that into a verb. It didn't even exist unless you were like 7 years old back in the day. You'd say, you're not my friend anymore. And the next day you'd play with them again. Like that was unfriending. But now there's a finality to it. Like you're done. You don't exist to me. And we're doing this to neighbors, relatives. You unfriend in this world. But the problem is it parlays into this world that we live in. And all of a sudden relationships are just being cast asunder. I say all that because the election disconnection that we are in is a prime example of the churn manifesting, where divisionist leaders are fomenting instability. We are in a trance state of fear and anger as we, catastrophize what's going to happen with the election. And I will tell you, because of the way these things were designed by the engineers who did it, to share negative information about outgroups, these are not arenas of democracy and civil discourse. They are digital killing fields, in my assessment. And I stand by that. These, when it comes to talking politics, are digital killing fields. They are not conducive to civil discourse and what this country was built upon for conversations about issues and how we differ on issues and how we solve issues. If you watch the conversations and the way they happen in here,
Right.
they are caustic, they are corrosive, they are tribal, they end terribly, they are hurtful. And if you think that you are engaging in civil discourse in here, you are part of the churn. And you're just be careful, because it is set up in such a way that it draws you into in-group, out-group behavior, which then puts you in a sympathetic state, a churn state, a trance state, where you become angry, and anger makes you stupid, you know? And so I just caution people, if you're gonna like engage in political discourse, be very careful on how you do it loosely in with these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's clear. I think that a lot of people get, as you call it, lost in the trance, lost in the churn. It's, you know, it's hard to see in the moment because you're caught up, but you know, it's a manipulation. It's designed for clicks. It's designed for profit. It's designed to drive behavior. The worst behavior,
Of course,
right?
shadow tribalism.
Yeah, the worst behavior, because we're you know, we're seemingly more attracted to that, you know, to that decadence, that depravity, than we are to, you know, bad, you know, I don't, if you think about it, even before even before phones, even before these devices, what did they say? If it bleeds, it leads, right? So news, right? So they've always known, that bad news gets the bigger ratings. For some reason, we're attracted to it.
We are.
And
we are.
so,
well, because we operate, you know, if you think of, again, below the waterline, right? If there's a merger in your company, if it gets announced that there's a merger, right? And it, to the bosses, to the senior leaders, it makes all the sense in the world. It goes on all the PowerPoint slides. Here's how we're going to do it. It's going to be awesome.
Yep.
People in the audience are sitting there going, oh my God, this is going to be terrible. Right. And there's such a disconnect between the bosses and the people in the audience. Why? Because the people in the audience are having a primal response to change. And the brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ. So it tells itself a story using neural story maps. What? From the last time something happened with a merger where they got their butt kicked. And that goes all the way back to our primal days, where our memories are based on traumatic events and things that kicked our butt. That's how we navigate the world, through fear-based behavior, unfortunately. And that dominates us. And this is a prime example of how divisionist leaders, they understand how the human operating system works. Like, it's not just us rooftop leaders. You know, there are divisionist leaders who understand the human operating system, and they engineer it into this represented reality that we've been sucked into. So as leaders, as parents, as teachers, if we don't have an appreciation for what's below the waterline, we're at the whim of leaders who are actually dividing us by design.
Right. Yeah, I think it becomes, I think your book points out a lot of this really well, makes it really in a compelling manner, such that everyone can understand what's going on, and also everyone can understand what needs to be done. We'll start to talk about that now. But really, you know, the more I think about it, and again, just, you know, having really dive deep into your book, I see it in my own life, and it just might be, as you age, you get this sense of wanting to go back to a simpler time, go get back to nature, get back to that, you call it the social contract society, get back to our roots in lots of different ways. And that's why there's so many of these primal movements, primal health, primal food. So there is a thirst, there is a hunger for it.
There is. And there is a pathway for it too, Lawrence. I really appreciate you bringing that up. if anything in this book resonates with you as you read through it, and you're like, man, I wish we could get back to that. Just then get back to it. Because we do have agency in our lives. That's what defines us as humans. We have agency. We are agents operating, expressing agency in our arena. And so express agency, like, utilize your autonomy to make conscious choices that allow you to do those things. If you wish you had more time with family, do Fire Pit Fridays. There are a range of things, but again, nobody's coming. Nobody's going to come and tell you to do this, right? This is on you. If we're waiting on institutional leaders to tell us to do these things, we're deluded, because that's not how they stay in control. It's not how they define success. And it's up to us to do that. But you can reclaim that. And you just said it yourself. Like, it is very doable. There are some tips in the book on how to do it. But at the end of the book, there's also some suggestions of other people to work with that you can just go super deep on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So now let's dive into the solutions to the churn, right?
Yeah.
And so you brought up one that I've been interested and fascinated in this concept for a long time: finding purpose, right? It's always been essential to true fulfillment in life. And it's something I've often reflected on, particularly around how one goes about discovering their passion or their purpose, right? Especially since so many people struggle to identify with what truly drives them or what they're meant to do. So that's why I really resonated with your chapter on meaning, right? Or the mandate to make sense, as you call it. You have this fantastic quote that opens up that chapter, right? And it's, I'll quote it now. It's ultimately, and this is Viktor Frankl, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. That might be the answer right there. But
I almost put like the end.
Yeah, right. It's like, wow. But then you got to unpack that, because it's like, okay, whoa, I had to read, I have to read that. I've read it a few times. I'm going to keep rereading it. But I'd love to get your thoughts on meaning, on passion, on purpose, and how one actually finds it. Because people always talk about follow your passion, find your purpose. And it's like, okay, how do you do it?
When we talk about, again, kind of going to 30,000 feet and looking at the book as you read it, once you get past the churn and the introduction to the human operating system is then, okay, as you said, like, okay, now what do I do in terms of reclaiming this? And so there are a lot of primal realities that are below the waterline that I've been working on for years, but the ones that I found that are the most prolific to leaders in the everyday form this acronym, MESS. And I like the notion that a lot of what we do as leaders is messy. It's not polished or clean. It's messy. It's human. It's primal. And so, that MESS is a meaning-seeking, emotional, social storyteller who struggles. And so then I build a chapter on each one of those. And what you've opened up now is meaning. And I put it first because there's a lot of neuroscience of late that just overwhelmingly confirms humans are meaning-seeking, meaning-making creatures. Dr. Kendall Haven says the brain has a mandate to make sense of the world, the make sense mandate. Now stop and think about that for a second. That includes your child who keeps asking, why, daddy? Why, daddy? Why, daddy? Or it includes your employee going, I don't understand why we're doing this. This does not make the brain has a mandate to make sense of the world. This is not the person across from you being a jackass. This is a mandate to make sense of things. And as leaders, we have an inherent responsibility to make sense of things and to help people make sense of things. It's how do we manage that? And how do we find meaning in a time of churn when we're running so hard? And, you think about, I know people watching this, they go from one Zoom call to the next. They don't have time to go to the bathroom. And then they have to go, they have to deal with go be a parent and be a husband or a wife. And it's a lot, but meaning is at the heart of it, right? Because we have a mandate to make sense of the world. And what I found is people follow leaders who are clear on their purpose. It gives a sense of psychological safety and connection and shared future to those we serve. And, that's from Daniel Coyle, but that clarity of purpose is your job and my job, right? And so what I've offered up in the book is that can be very hard to do. Like you said, like where do I even start with that?
Right.
I think even Simon Sinek, who really did an expert job of bringing this forward as a requirement, I think even he struggles at times to really get to like, how do you do that? Because the brain almost doesn't even have language for that. We all struggle with ways to do it, but one thing I offer up that I found works well for me is what I call leaving tracks. And if, I think it's a good place to start when you're trying to get clear on your meaning or your purpose, or you haven't done in a while, is rather than just go, who am I? Why am I here? Is to say, what would I want someone to say about me who was with me in my final moments to someone that I'd never met 15 years after I'm gone? And about the tracks that I left in this world. And by tracks, I mean these indelible impressions in the earth. That's what my dad always calls it, leaving tracks, because he's a woodsman. And that's the metaphor he would always use for my brother and me, is leaving our tracks, the things that don't serve you or those around you, but the people who follow you years later. And I think if we start there, like, what do you want to be remembered for? What are the things? It could be being a great parent. It could be being a good friend. In fact, I do this all over the world, and I found that most people talk very little about work. The tracks they want to leave are much deeper. But I do think those offer us then a North Star, a guiding waypoint, a true north, as our context changes over time to really get at that. So I would say that for starters is that there are in the book techniques and suggestions on how to get clarity of meaning. And it may feel clunky and frustrating and emotional, but what I will tell you is it's worth it. The work to get clarity on your purpose will be life-changing if you will pursue it with commitment.
Yeah, you call it legacy and for instance, tracks for our children, tracks of capacity.
Yeah.
Right. Tracks of relationship, leaving
Yes.
those tracks
Yes.
will lead you to meaning.
That's right. And I kind of break it down even further.
Yeah.
What I've found is that there's really three categories, and they're not all inclusive, but there are three areas that I consistently see as I travel around the world doing one-on-one coaching and speaking and my workshops, are that the people want to leave some kind of capacity in the world, whether it's with their for-profit business or, in their nonprofit, but they want a capacity that is in place that wasn't there before, after they're gone. Right. Two is with our youth. One of the biggest tracks we can leave in this world is with our young people, is how we prepare them to lead us into better days, whether that's our kids or whether it's like my friend David, who didn't have kids but had two little brothers that he adopted off the streets. That we can leave tracks with our youth in a range of ways. And then finally is relationships. I talk in the book about a relationship that my dad, his dad in the Appalachian Mountains, Howard Mann, as an old Baptist preacher, had with a Cherokee preacher that came forward years later with my dad after his dad had passed on, that actually allowed them to restore a functionally extinct tree. Yeah. It was a multi-generational relationship that was, you build trust when risk is low, you leverage it when risk is high. And that relationship came full circle, decades later, to make a very big, the first ever indigenous orchard with this tree in North America from one relationship, one friendship. And I've seen this time and time again, is the tracks that we can leave with our relationships, our friendships. You never know how that will serve. And I just think that's kind of good news for those of us who are leading in these times of churn when everything's so complex and ambiguous, to know that I can leave big legacy in my kids and in my relationships and in the capacity that I'm building in my for-profit or nonprofit.
Yeah, I love it. I've never heard it. I've never heard it explained that way, and I really do think it's a powerful guide stone to help people kind of get a sense of how they could go about finding purpose and meaning.
Yeah.
And I
Try
love
it.
it. I love it.
Try it. I invite people to just try it and see what happens. And then I think at a minimum, you're going to start to get more clarity than what you had, which is a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk about emotion, the E in the mess.
Yeah.
You're right, managing emotional temperature.
Yep.
But there's a particular question I have for you here, because it's almost like, I think your insight on this could be powerful. So you say you say pushing down our emotions, burying them. And that part isn't really new. People understand that when you bury your emotions, they're going to erupt in all kinds of chaotic ways. But you talk about how pushing down those emotions is killing our veterans, it's killing our kids, it's killing our first responders. It's right. You say over the last 5 years that you've lost 9 friends to suicide. And you say these were high performing individuals who pushed their hurt and anger down deeper and deeper and deeper until they couldn't reach them anymore or even name them to tell you what it was they were feeling. The only way they could relieve the agonizing pressure was through self-harm. And you talk about this in the book also, and you mentioned it earlier in the podcast. You also came very close to ending your life. In fact, seconds away from pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
When something happened that pulled you back from the brink. We'll leave that for people to read about in the book. But the question I have is, knowing what you know about your own circumstances and what led you to almost pull the trigger, as well as what drives others to do this, and what you now comprehend about the human operating system, because from what you describe in the book, that's actually what caused you to dive deep into really understanding what drives us. Is there something that someone could have done to derail you from that path to putting the gun in your hand? For instance, if you notice someone headed down this road now, what would you do?
Yeah.
If someone in our lives might be in circumstances that could lead them to take their life, what is it? How do we kind of disconnect them from that track, kind of lead them away from it when they're not even talking about it?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I'll hit this at a couple of levels. I'll start with just the most urgent and tactical, I think we have to do more peer-to-peer training and work on this, so that, first of all, I don't think it is an epidemic with veterans and first responders, and it's getting worse. It is also an epidemic with our children. It's getting worse. But I also think in just general population, after 2+ years of COVID and all of the stuff that's come out of that, regardless of how you felt about COVID, the reality is there is a mental health tsunami that is coming our way, that is happening now, where people are committing suicide in ways that are just exponentially higher. And so I think as leaders, as corporate leaders, as business owners, as supervisors, parents, we've got to acknowledge, that we have a problem. It's kind of like what we had to do in the military, because for the longest time in the military, if you committed suicide, your family was not even really treated that well at funerals, and it was really almost like a mark of shame. And hopefully we've gotten better about that. But I think that we've got to just acknowledge that it is a growing phenomenon in our society. And I think that tip of the iceberg, bottom of the iceberg, metaphorically has some answers in it, in the sense that in the modern world, we're all conditioned to push our emotions down, right? So like, if you were going to recognize some people in your organization, or one person in particular who had done so much for the team, and now she's going to be retiring, and she's also looking at a battle with cancer that's just shown up, and it's really rough, and it doesn't look good, right? And you're starting to feel that as you recognize her in front of her peers who she's worked with all these years, and her family's there, and you look over at her kids, and you've known them since they were little, and you start to get emotional in front of everybody. What are the first 2 words out of your mouth?
That's a good question. I mean,
Typically, what do people say when they get emotional when they're in front of other people and they don't expect to get emotional? I'm sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And they start to almost panic.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. But that's how that's not what we're supposed to do. That's not how human emotion is supposed to happen. Emotion is a natural thing. In fact, this is what Dr. Diego at our Own Every Room workshop that I just taught this past weekend out at a dude ranch. We were talking about this, and he says this. He says, he's a psychologist. Emotions are the basis of how we organize attention, motivation, and thoughts. It is how memories form and are retrieved. Emotions are our main resource for learning and meaning making. We tend to ignore them as a culture and treat them like a symptom, when in fact, emotional access is the pathway to our healing. So, we do the opposite of what's supposed to happen with the emotion. So that repression, suppression that happens is actually a physiological, there's a cost to that. And you keep doing that over time. And then that bottom of the iceberg, it's going to make its way to the top one way or the other. Like what sunk the Titanic was not what was the tip of the iceberg. It was what you couldn't see. And that's what happens. It resurfaces itself in a way that's not appropriate for the moment. And so I think as leaders, we have to understand that. We have to model it ourselves. You ask about, like, could suicide be prevented? I think it can. But one thing that we have to do as leaders, I think, is we have to have emotional access. We have to be willing to be present with our emotions and tolerate ourselves when we are in high stakes moments, when we're talking with our kids. And if an emotion comes on, it comes on, and not bury these things down and kind of like grit it out, grind it out, rub dirt on it. And I'm not saying that we have a therapy session in front of our employees either, right? But I'm simply saying that leaders have got to have a level of emotional access on this stuff and model it, and that includes the vulnerability and relatability that goes with it. And on a tactical level, I think we need more peer-to-peer training for suicide prevention and just mental health stuff in general. I think that peers need to know how to, for example, if you see someone that is clearly ideating over suicide or giving hints, is, hey, dude, are you thinking about killing yourself? And that you intervene and that you
just come right out and say it.
I do. If I think that's happening, I'm going to ask. And I just feel that way. And the training that I've had in the past is, is if you feel that that's about to happen, is asking the question.
Right.
And there's a good chance at times they may tell you they're not. You might even think about, like on this podcast, is having, because I don't want to be, I don't want to get out over my skis on this one. Mm-hmm. You might think about having somebody on that could actually talk about peer-to-peer actions in, these type of moments. I think it's definitely a very worthwhile service to do. But know what you do when you're confronted with that in that moment. Like, what action do you take? If it's your kid, if it's your, and I would feel more comfortable someone actually addressing that than me.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah. I think having lived through it yourself, and many of your, your brothers in arms, having, seen it happen, nose to the grindstone, so to speak.
Yeah.
I thought hearing your view on what we need to look for and how we need to address it and maybe prevent it, right? Because if there's a way of getting someone to move off of that track and kind of interrupt, as they're going down that road, then, I think that's valuable to understand how to do that. So I might hit you up later and ask your advice on who might be good to interview on that.
Well, that guy that I just talked about, Doc Diego, would be really great. I can connect you. We'll hook up offline. I've got a lot of resources that I'd be happy to connect you with. But I do think storytelling, talking about mental health, talking about the challenges that are out there, and honestly, I think leaders getting really honest about their own mental health. And it was not easy for me to write the chapters that are in that book about my challenges with mental health, and it was not pleasant at all. but I just believe that it's important. It's important to talk about it in such a way that we're honest and transparent about it, because I do think that is a good way to help people that are going through it realize they're not alone. They're not as isolated as they think, that other people have been there and are there, and that there is a pathway to reach out and connect with people, and that there is a, you know, it's a long-term solution to a short-term problem, you know, like to do something like that.
Yeah. No, that's great. So there's one thing I want to ask just quickly, and I want to skip over this because you mentioned again so the concept of pushing down emotion, you say pushing down emotions in the context of our modern existence,
Yeah,
also creates a kind of machine imitation feedback loop.
yeah,
And you mentioned this a few times in the book, mimicking machines.
yeah.
So can you just this is really important because, like, you know, it's become a thing, and when I'm reading you say this, I'm like, this is so on the money, you know, because we'll even say when you're like lauding somebody, say, oh, he's a machine.
The machine, or I got to feed the machine.
Yeah.
You know, and I really have to give credit to Dr. Ian McGilchrist on this in his book, The Master and the Emissary, and his emissary. And this is where a lot of my work on the left hemisphere, right hemisphere comes from. But one of the things that, you know, we talked about the left hemisphere being obsessed with control and manipulation, and the right hemisphere being really focused on relationships and creativity, and they both are necessary, right? But because humans throughout our history have been, we also are obsessed with mimicry. We imitate throughout history animals that we're hunting. You know, we imitate them in ceremonies, like we imitate. That's what we do.
Right.
And it's a subconscious thing. But with the advent of technology, we have become subconsciously obsessed with mimicking machines. And so we want to replicate the machine. And I believe a lot of the stuff in our civil society and contract society today is that we want to be as efficient as possible. We want to be as, you know, we want to get stuff done the way it needs to be done without the, you know, we don't want emotion to get in the way. We look at emotion, as Dr. Diego said, as an obstacle, as a symptom, as weakness. And the reality is it's not. I mean, if you understand the human operating system, you know that emotion is actually a biological necessity to making meaning and processing the world as we navigate it. We are emotional creatures first. There was a book on strokes that says a lot of people think that we are logical creatures who happen to feel. But the reality is that's not true. We are feeling creatures who just happen to think. And if we don't give emotions their due, then we are mimicking machines. And that gives a green light to the left hemisphere to just focus on algorithms and language and control and manipulation. And look what's happening in our world today. You know, anger is a left hemisphere emotional function. The others are on the right hemisphere, and they're suppressed, right. You know? And so a lot of what we're reclaiming here, Lawrence, is our own nature. It is the right hemisphere stuff that, you know, the creativity and storytelling. And it sounds kind of woo-woo, but it's not, right? It is our way of being in the world. And we don't necessarily get a vote on that. If we just defy that in favor of just trying to become like a machine and living in a represented reality, then you get what you pay for. And I think that's very scary stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. All right. So we're going to get into storytelling, but before we do, social, S, right? So the first S in the mess is social. I love what you said before about relationship being, you know, an asset, not the means to a transaction. Relationship is the asset.
Right.
But you know, this whole thing about social, you talk about it as, and relationship, connection. And you say, connect like your life depends on it. And I got to tell you, Scott, the Jim Gant Sitting Bull story I've never been struck by the thought of connection as much as the story you told. Speaking
Right.
of the power of storytelling, right, which you demonstrate in the book with the stories, but that
Yeah.
had meaning.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could just, because it's not a long story, but if you could tell the
No.
Afghan Sitting Bull story.
Yeah, we talked about Lawrence of Arabia earlier, right? Well, there's
Yes.
another guy in modern times that has been referred to often as Lawrence of Afghanistan. He's a friend of mine. His name is Jim Gant. He was former Green Beret, and he spent years and years in Afghanistan. And in the very beginning of the war, he went into Afghanistan not long after it started, and he was put in this valley that was in eastern Afghanistan, the Konar River Valley, very, very dangerous place. The Momon tribe, one of the most dangerous warlike tribes in all of eastern Afghanistan, and he just drove one way in, one way out into that valley with his little team, and ended up asking for a meeting with the elder Malik Nur Afzal, who agreed to meet with him. And Jim, when he met with him, he took off his body armor and he sat with him. And Jim had the foresight, the wherewithal to leave the body armor off and to just, be present and make a connection, build that rapport. And one of the first things he did was he showed Afzal video footage of the World Trade Center collapsing and people jumping to their deaths. And Jim just sat there and let them watch it, these circle of elders. And when it was over, the elder said to Jim, no one's ever showed me that. I've not seen that. And he goes, I know why you're here now. And at that point, he was ready to listen. Remember we talked about that?
Mm-hmm.
He was ready to listen to what Jim had to say. There was still work to be done. There was still a relationship to be built, social capital, but they talked well into the night. And mostly it was Jim asking them open-ended questions that, like Chris Voss says, start with what and how, and allowed them to tell stories back. And as it did, emotional temperature started to come down in the room. And more you felt this palpable sense of connection. They weren't talking politics. They weren't talking ideology. They weren't talking Taliban. They were telling stories. They were telling stories about universal, singular things that mattered to these elders. And then finally it came back to Jim, and they asked him, like, what, where are you from? What was it like? And he told them about growing up in the Southwest and his love of the Native American tribes. He was a poor kid, but he revered Sitting Bull, the Native American chief who was so warlike and who had waged guerrilla warfare for years against the government, and very successfully. And he looked at Nur Afzal. He said, the way you fought against the Soviets, you remind me of Sitting Bull. And everybody laughed at that. And for the rest of the time that elder lived, he became known as Sitting Bull. Even his sons called him Sitting Bull. And that started a relationship between Jim and this elder that led to very big stuff getting done, to include a copy of Jim's One Tribe at a Time book being found in the bedroom of Osama bin Laden when the SEALs took him out, with margin notes to his intelligence chief that said, this has got to stop. This is the biggest threat we face in Afghanistan. Was the story of Jim and Malik John, or Nur Afzal. And, that, why did that happen? What Jim knew he had to make a connection in 5 minutes or less, or he was dead. But he never lost the urgency and the intention of connecting, and he did it as if his life depended on it, because it did. And so he gave that connection the reverence it deserved. And my question is, why wouldn't we do that with our child? Why wouldn't we do that with a prospect? Why wouldn't we connect as if our life depends on it? Because in many ways it does. We've become so casual about it. As social creatures with no fur, fangs, or claws, sitting on top of the food chain, relationships are all we have. And in this time of churn, if we don't start getting more serious about the relationships and how we approach them, and more intentional, we're in trouble. Look at how we abandoned Afghanistan, right? Look at how we left those allies in the dirt. That is a manifestation of how we think about relationships, right? And you don't get mulligans on that one. Like, if you did that in kindergarten, you'd be a very lonely kid.
That's right.
I think it's a mindset thing. It is this notion that the relationships that you have, those are the biggest assets you have. Your social portfolio is your book of business. And connect like your life depends on it, because in reality it does.
Powerful. There's so much good stuff in this book. Let's dive into storytelling. This
My
is
favorite.
This
My
is
favorite.
you. Yeah, absolutely. So, I just thinking about the concept of storytelling, and reading everything you had to say on it. I want to ask, with the rise of social media,
Yeah.
reels, shorts, 180 character tweets, storytelling seems to be on the wane, right? But back in the 1970s, TV series had 22 to 24 episodes per season, but now that number's down to 8 or 10. In fact, some of them are even 6 episodes long. And Gen Z doesn't even watch traditional TV, and even avoids streaming platforms like Netflix. Rather, they're glued to platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Twitch, but not as most people think. They're not immersed in the subject matter. Instead, they mainly use the majority of content on these platforms as background noise while they're multitasking. So, with little focus on long form material, I'm just wondering, is storytelling still valued in the way it once was?
What a great question. A very, very, you talk about good, your questionology, Lawrence, is phenomenal. And I mean, that is one of the most important leadership skills out there today, is asking beautiful questions. And that is a beautiful question. So let me give it the attention it deserves. I think to answer that, you have to unpack it a little bit. And I think we have to go, you just expertly defined another manifestation of churn. And it was the 4Ds. Remember, we talked about distraction. We have an unprecedented level of distraction in the West today. The average attention span of an adult human is like 8 seconds.
That's
and
right.
so it is not a foregone conclusion that when you get in front of a client or you get in front of a classroom of kids, that you're going to hold their attention for more than 10 seconds. They're moving on. And this is, in my assessment, another example of a left hemisphere takeover that has an obsession with control and manipulation and that kind of thing of having and acquiring versus relationships, connection, creativity that's kind of gone dormant. And so the more the left hemisphere takes over, the more it craves these little sound bites that are just background noise. The other thing is, and I don't think you'll find a neuroscience that would scientist that would disagree with me, multitasking is a myth. Multitasking is not possible. People think they're multitasking, but they're actually working in sequence, and not very well. If you ever try to talk to somebody who's on their phone, they can't even have a conversation with you. And so, all of these are examples of why we need to get back to long form communications. Now, I'm not an idiot. I realize that we will be using these to communicate. Mm-hmm. And we will have to adapt the stories that we tell, but we should never sacrifice the narrative structure and the way that stories work on the brain. The brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ. It's one of those below the waterline realities that guys like Kendall Haven and Ivan Tyrrell, who have done tons of data research on this and measured brain activity with EEGs, are saying that storytelling is a sense-making tool. In the brain's mandate to make sense of the world, the brain tells itself a story using metaphors, and then it creates new patterns. That's why Lawrence was able to convince the Badu nomads to actually go and take Aqaba from the desert, even though it had never happened. It seemed impossible, was because he told them a story of his time as a geologist there, when he recognized that all the guns pointed toward the ocean. And so as a master storyteller, he created a new pattern in their mind of something that hadn't even happened yet, right? And that's what great leaders do, that they use storytelling as a way to create new patterns of what's possible when the brain's trying to make sense of things. And that's why long form communications, why storytelling is so critical. And if you surrender that to what the tip of the iceberg modern world says you should do, then you lose your influence, right? Now, you do it the other way and you say, all right, I'm going to study storytelling big time. I'm going to learn how to tell stories in long form. Then you can adapt them to short form. I mean, Hemingway had a bet with a reporter. This legacy goes, this legend, at his place down in Florida, a fifth of liquor, I believe, was the wager.
Right.
that he could tell a sad story in 6 words. And the reporter's like, there's no way you could do that. And he said, okay, it's a bet. And then he said, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. So we can tell stories in short form if we get below the waterline and we have an appreciation for the design and the delivery of the story. So you can do it 2-dimensionally, not as effectively, I don't think, but it can be done. And my plea to people reading the book, to include the Gen Z folks, is if you really want to be the relevant person in the room and the person that is relatable to the pain of your peers, become the storyteller in chief of your arena. And you will own every room you walk into in a very healthy way. And it takes some work. It's not just designing stories, it's the ability to tell them. And I talk about this in the book. It's a physical act that requires a primal connection to our past. But if you do the work on it, and I'll say one more thing on it too, to give you an example, Lawrence. I'm getting ready to go downstairs after this podcast, and I'm gonna talk with a very, very large company in Vegas about the challenges that they're facing with a merger. And you think, all right, what's a retired Green Beret how in the world are you gonna talk to these senior executives about the challenges they're facing with a merger? Well, what they're going through in that merger is nothing more than in-group, out-group behavior that is primal and tribal. So I'm actually going to tell them a story of a shovel fight that happened in Afghanistan that I write about in my book, where 2 cousins fought over water with shovels and it grew into a feud. But that shovel fight is the exact same thing that happens when a merger happens. They just use passive aggressive behavior, but the conditions and why it happens are exactly the same. And stories allow us to bridge those gaps and make meaning from those 2 worlds. And that's where you can take your lived experiences and put them into the service of your audience with stories in ways that have no ceiling.
Listen, I can testify to that because, as I said, between watching for the first time Lawrence of Arabia and from your Jim Gant story, the Jim Gant Sitting Bull story, nothing has ever spoken to me as strongly about connection and what it all means as those 2 things. So, yeah, you're right. Again, it's why I think this book is so valuable. So, okay, just a few more questions. As you're preparing to meet with those who are going to go through the merger. So you also say, and this is also really powerful about storytelling. You say the story is not about you, even though it could be your story. You say it's not about you, that it's about others. How? Because you're always thinking that you're telling a story to either entertain someone, you're telling a story to sell someone, you're telling a story to motivate someone, but you say it's not about what I'm looking to do.
Right. Yeah. It seems weird. And I will tell you, I'll start with, the 3 biggest things I hear on the road when I work with people on telling their story. And I work with executives that don't want to tell their story. I work with entertainers, coaches, but also trauma victims, Gold Star family members, soldiers, who they'll say one of 3 things. I don't have a story. My story's not as good as hers, or nobody wants to hear my story. And all of those are forms of what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance, the inner self-sabotage that we feel that stands between us and our higher aspirations. It's self-sabotage. It's that's what's going on when you're telling yourself those things. No, and I don't want it to be about me. Nobody wants to hear my story. And it is a degree of humility, and I respect it. But here, let's just go back below the waterline and let's look at storytelling throughout the ages. How was storytelling really used, right? So if you and I are sitting around the fire pit 10,000 years ago, and there's other tribal members there, and I come staggering into the fire pit area, and I'm all bloodied up, and I say, let me tell you guys, while saber-toothed tigers make crappy pets, everybody's going to listen like this. Right? Because there's about to be some crystallized lessons from a lived experience that clearly are very important, because I'm bloodied up. I've been through it. I've been through a struggle, and I've learned something. Story has evolved for us socially as a mechanism by which we can learn about the world as if we lived the experience ourselves. I'm going to say that again. Storytelling is a mechanism that has allowed us to learn about the world as if we lived the experience ourselves that the teller is sharing with us. It's called autobiographical listening. And you've probably experienced it either in reading, or you've heard a TED talk, or when a speaker is talking and you literally feel like you're in the story with them. My friend Holly, who's one of my story coaches, she's a Gold Star mom. She lost her son, Danny, in Afghanistan, but she goes back to when Danny was telling her he was going to join the Air Force and be a bomb disposal guy. And she was out pulling weeds in the garden. And he sat down next to her in the black dirt and started pulling weeds with her. And she knew right away that her teenager did not pull weeds unless he was wanting something. But in that moment, you can see the black dirt. You can see Danny pulling the weeds, even though you've never seen Danny, right? But we have a personal connection, and that's called autobiographical listening. When we have the willingness to repurpose our struggles in the service of others, I call it the generosity of scars. People locate themselves in that struggle, and they make sense of their own lived experience in the safety of your narrative. So by definition, it's not about you. You are merely a vessel or a vehicle that is providing a narrative bubble for the audience, for the listener to make sense of their own experience and find new patterns. It's the most generous thing a leader can do. But you have to get out of your own way. You have to get over yourself and realize that especially the trauma and the struggle and the stories you don't want to tell yourself are probably the very things that person that you asked about suicide is probably thinking in that moment. You know, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, "Hey man, I stood in that same closet." And that's all they have to say.
Yeah.
You know, they know. And you realize in that moment, you're like, oh my God, as hard as that was, that's not about me. It's just not about me. It's about the story, and it's about the audience. And if you can make that transition, and it takes courage, if you can make it and you will train on it that way, your life will never be the same. And you will get big stuff done like never before. But it requires a level of generosity that, frankly, the tip of the iceberg world doesn't prepare us for. And so, you know, we have to do it ourselves and just trust the biology of storytelling. And, you know, like it works.
The biology of storytelling. Powerful. Okay, two more questions for you.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
So there's the ability to tell an interesting story. And then there's narrative competence, as you call it.
Yeah.
So let me quote you. This is you in the book saying, if I'm training Green Berets who are about to deploy into a low trust, dangerous environment, and I only have time to teach either tactics for close quarters combat or narrative competence, I'll teach the latter. I'll teach narrative competence every damn time. Well, I'll tell you what, I would have thought close quarters combat sounds like a powerful and incredibly important skill to learn.
Right.
So what is narrative competence?
So first of all, to just put that in context, I'm not diminishing the importance of being able to handle yourself or, coercive. And no, I'm actually building on what you're saying. And I appreciate you framing it this way, because when you and I started, what we said was, you know, Lawrence of Arabia and these guys that accomplished big things, they were very good fighters. They were very coercive when they needed to be, but it's not what they were remembered for. What Lawrence is remembered for is his ability to inspire and move through storytelling. What Jim Gant is remembered for is the same thing. And I think leaders throughout our history, Oxford Analytica has done a study that says that leaders from Alexander the Great to Martin Luther King to Lady Gaga, who created movements of people that did big things, they had vision and they had a personal story that conveyed that vision, right? And so I just think that's really, really critical. So, you know, when we think about narrative competence, what I'm talking about here is it's one thing to be able to get up and tell your story from the stage, right, in a prepared way. But it's another thing to leverage purposeful storytelling in real time to meet your goals, right? And sometimes storytelling might be the stories you ask to hear. In fact, a lot of times that's what it is. It's 2/3 of the engagement is you asking stories of the other party or questions that let them respond in story. And so narrative competence is the ability to leverage storytelling in real time to meet your goals, whether that's a one-on-one engagement with a client, an upset employee who you're having to let go, or a teenager who's going through it. How do you use narrative in real time? That is a competency that you must train on. And the other thing that I found, candidly, I found that in corporate America, tech sector, finance, special ops, if I go in and say, I'm going to teach your people storytelling, they're like, oh, storytelling. But if I say, I'm going to teach them narrative competence, they're like, ooh.
Yes, right.
And so again, but in fairness, we have this preconceived notion of storytelling as bedtime for bonzo or something that you do for therapy, right? But the reality is narrative competence is what all of us need if we're playing high stakes engagements, because stories are how the brain makes sense of things. Every brain in the world makes sense of the world through storytelling. So if you don't have narrative competence, you're not a player. You're not relevant. And that's where I think, to your point, where you're talking about how everybody's on these short form communications kicks, they're just leaving value on the table. And so the work to develop narrative competence, lifetime endeavor. I start to open it up in the book about how you can do it, but it is, of all the letters in that book, to the end of the line.
Just say that. We lost you for just a second. Just say that last 30 seconds again.
Of all of the letters that are in that book, meaning, emotion, social connection, struggle, storytelling is the engine that will drive you to effective connection in every aspect of your life. If you are a good storyteller, all of those other things, meaning, emotion, struggle, they will take care of themselves.
Yeah, you call it the engine of, it's an engine of hope.
Engine of hope. Stories give hope. That's the other thing. And Lord knows we need some hope nowadays.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this, speaking of which, this kind of leads me to my final question, although there's probably 10 others I could ask you, but I want to be respectful of your time. You've been very generous, Scott, with your time. So you talk about scar stories, stories of struggle, hero's journey, right? Like these things resonate, these terms, they resonate. Talking about them, actually being able to tell that story, not from a matter of competence or ability, but from the weakness that we all have emotionally of opening up and being vulnerable. It makes it difficult. We could be the greatest. We could be the greatest natural storyteller in the world, great skills of oratory, and we can, might be great at emoting and this kind of thing, but we never really get there because we're not being vulnerable. But you talk about two things. You say you say so many in our transactional world still have a lot of problems with the V word, being vulnerable.
Yeah.
These people feel that they're putting themselves at risk. They worry that they're sticking out their jugular in a cutthroat world. You say, try a little adjustment. Don't just be vulnerable, be relatable. And so I want you to, explain what this really means, because my question is, describe the difference. What's the difference between being vulnerable and being relatable?
Sure. Okay. Have you ever noticed that, like, if you're having a conversation and a leader does open up, and someone will say, I appreciate you being vulnerable, right? And it's like, sometimes it's like, well, how do I do that? I don't, and when do I do that? Because there are times, certainly in my previous profession, if I'm consciously vulnerable, I get killed, right? So for example, telling a soldier who is now a corporate leader to be vulnerable is a very tall order, because it's like, dude, I spent 25 years of my life and I'm alive because I didn't do that. And now you're telling me to do that. And but what I'm seeing around me with all the passive aggressive corporate backstabbing, I don't think so. So it's, to me, vulnerability, while I understand the intention behind it, and I do think there's a necessity to it. Daniel Coyle in the Culture Code calls it signaling vulnerability, where Navy SEAL commanders would do that. I just think in the time of churn that we live in, where everybody's got their back up and they're protecting their jugular, vulnerability at its face is a difficult thing to achieve when you're trying to communicate. And so what I have found is go back to the first S in mess, which is social. We are social creatures. We are wired to connect with each other. It's our superpower. And how does that happen? Well, we connect with other humans we relate to, right? I connect to people I relate to. You connect to people you relate to.
Yes.
And I have found that even in this time of churn, if I say to someone, are you intentional about being relatable to this person right now? Are you being relatable to your daughter in this moment? Are you being relatable to your employee who you're going to have to let go right now as she's talking to you? Right? Is that your intention? Because I think we know how to do that. And I think if we are intentional about being relatable, particularly to the pain of another party, then we will, by definition, employ the appropriate amount of vulnerability to do that. Vulnerability will come alongside us in a way that is super authentic, right? So vulnerability, in my mind, is not the end game, right? Vulnerability is a necessary ingredient in being relatable. And so if I'm focused on the pictures in the head of the other party, and it means everything to me from a point of discovery, because the relationship is the asset, that I can see Lawrence's goals and his pain, and I can articulate those back to you to the degree of accuracy that you say, that's right, Scott, then I will, just in doing that, demonstrate an appropriate level of vulnerability. And then if I say to you, Lawrence, would it be all right if I share a story about my mental health that I think might actually speak to this? And you say, sure. And I'm doing that with a level of synthesis focused on your pain and goals, and sharing my struggle in the service of what you're going through. I'll be vulnerable enough to make that happen. And so it's a component of narrative competence, really. It's not being vulnerable for the sake of being vulnerable, because I just think some people can't get there, Right. But I do think most people know how to at least move towards being relatable. And if you do that with an intention of seeing the pain and the goals in the head of the other party, their pictures, vulnerability will just start to happen. And then if you share stories, particularly stories of struggle that are in the service of that party to help, make you more relatable to them, to help them see they're not alone, vulnerability is just a natural byproduct of that. It'll happen.
See, this is why what you talk about in this book is so impactful, because throughout my career, throughout my life, a lot of the storytelling by most people who do it comes across and is worked as a presentation.
Yes.
As opposed to, right? It's like we're presenting.
Yeah.
You called it you say PowerPoint, right? We're presenting. Very different from what you're describing here, which I kind of interpreted as revealing. So instead of me presenting to you, I'm revealing something to you. And
yes, that's right. That's right, Lawrence. And you're taking one plate off at a time, right? You're taking one armor plate off at a time so that you can make a connection and be relatable. And that's where people, so the rule here on this, and I'll just build on what you just said, no struggle, no story. This is the difference between a speaker and a storyteller. A speaker is up there for themselves. They're up there for themselves. They'll be the ones strutting backstage after it's over going, yeah, I nailed it. Right. A storyteller will likely be kind of bent over with sweat dripping off their nose, and they will feel the weight of what they just did because they revealed struggles in the service of others, right? It's a generous act. It's a physical act, and it's exhausting. And it takes all of you to do that, right? And in doing that, it is the most authentic, genuine human thing a leader can do. And what it is met with by the other party is reciprocity, right? That relatability, that connection. That's why people, when you've watched a storyteller or a speaker that really moved you, you have to go talk to them right after they're done. Right. That's why people, that is reciprocity in action. And what you've done in that moment is you've taken all these diverse people and you've got them ready to listen. You have moved through the emotional temperature, and they are now ready to listen to what you have to say. And you have now entered the realm of shared perspective, which is one of the most profound forms of social capital we have in this time of change, is shared perspective. Because now we relate to one another. You can't hate the storyteller if the storyteller brings struggle to the party. And it's tough, but you're right. That observation is spot on. And the problem with it is, as you start to integrate struggle into what you do, you'll start to feel resistance of, nobody wants to hear this. This is not the appropriate time to do it. It's not as good as this person over here. And you'll pull back. And it's very difficult, but the personal stories that give people a sense of who you are and the struggles you've encountered to overcome things. That's why I start with the hero's journey in that book.
Yes.
Those will be the stories that will actually open people up to the business lessons and ideas that you want to convey. Because as I say in the book, this adage by Carl Rogers, a psychologist, is what's personal is universal. It's a rule of storytelling. It will never change in our lifetime. It just doesn't feel that way because of the modern world. But what's personal is universal, and it always will be. If it matters to you, it'll matter to me.
Yeah, I think you captured it just perfectly right there with that image you just created about how, the speaker is kind of like, pumping their fist, right? But the storyteller is just dripping sweat and just exhausted. Because they've just released so much. That's powerful.
Complete generosity in the service of others. And that is the generosity of scars. And if you build that skill set, everything else will work itself out. Everything else will fall in place. And that is, in my opinion, the real secret sauce to getting big stuff done, is to be generous with your scars. And look for ways to repurpose your struggles through narrative in the service of others as you lead, and you'll be surprised what that'll get you to.
Incredible. Scott, thank you so much. Where can our audience learn more, find out more about you, kind of dive into your work? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, man. First of all, I just want to remind people too that when you read this book is for you. It is. I truly believe we are on the cusp of an upswing in our society where we're gonna take the country to better days, and our communities and our families. I do believe that, and I've spent most of my life, at least the last few years, at war, and I have every reason to be pessimistic, but I'm not. I'm actually very optimistic, and I look at like what you're doing with this podcast and this platform, Lawrence. I mean, this is how we get back to better days. And so the book really does supplement, I believe, whatever it is you're building. And hopefully that will serve you. But if you want to go deeper, what it hopefully also will activate a thirst that you'll see. This is not a hack. This is not a quick fix. This is a lifetime body of work that is very rewarding, that is fun, and a really cool community of rooftop leaders from all industries. So my website, scottmann.com.
Okay.
If you go there, all of my body of work is there. Everything from the nonprofit play to my own every room workshop that I run twice a year out at a dude ranch in Florida, where we do storytelling around a fire. I still teach it myself personally. It's a very intimate event. The next one is March 1. And then also, I guess the last thing I would leave with, Lawrence, if people would order the book is, I think this is a movement, and I really do I want to hit the bestseller list like we did with Pineapple when everybody said we couldn't do it, and it was a grassroots movement of people that said, this is what we care about. So I hope that the people will pre-order the book or get it now. And then Patreon. I started a Patreon page for folks that want to go deeper with me, to get behind the scenes on speaking, that want to get tips while I'm on the move and just study the craft. For like the price of a cup of coffee. I've got a Scott Mann Patreon page. My podcast is moving there, and there's going to be a lot of cool stuff there as well.
This is phenomenal stuff. I've read countless self-help books, lots and lots of special operator bios, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets. I truly believe that this book is one of the most impactful that I've read, and just it resonates, man. It resonates. So awesome work, awesome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lawrence. It's really been an honor being. And thank you for all of the research that you did with the book, all of the preparation that you did. It's not lost on me. I do a lot of podcasts, and can count on one hand the number of hosts who do the level of preparation that you've done. And it's not lost on me. Thank you. It means a lot that you've taken the time to dig into that body of work like that. And your folks must really adore you for that, because that is not easy. And you doing that for, I'm sure you do it for everybody, but good job. Because that's action.
It's a labor of joy. So, but again, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Absolutely fantastic discussion. So compelling, so interesting. And thank you again for your service.
Yes, sir.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you. And Alpha Human Podcast, we're out.